Alright, what's up everyone? Shane, aka Wild Poker here, and I am back with another hand history review. And again, it's one of my own hands, but as always guys, if you ever want to have a chance to have me review one of your hands in depth using, Pio or Card Runners V or whatever software needs to be used, use the link under this video in the description to go to my Discord and start submitting some hands in the hand discussion thread. And if you have something that brings about some really interesting topics or discussion points, then it'll definitely have a really high chance of getting put into a video. And even if it doesn't get put into a video, maybe it's something that really doesn't need that in-depth of a breakdown, it will still definitely get a response in the thread. So worst case scenario, you're still getting a chance to talk about a hand that maybe you had a tough decision in. So for this hand guys, and for this video, I mean, if you're looking at the length of the video already, you know that this is going to be a long, really in-depth review. So I would suggest, get your beverages ready, get your snacks ready, buckle in and get ready to really grind through this video. I definitely think it's going to be worth it. A lot of interesting stuff to talk about here, and you won't regret it. So, but be prepared guys, be prepared because it's going to be a long one. So yeah, let's get to the hand here. Pretty standard open, obviously. So when I'm getting 3-bet by a pretty aggressive regular in this hand, he's 3-betting me about 17% in the big blind versus my small blind open over, over 5,000 hands. So definitely enough hands to know that this is probably just what his frequency is going to be against me. When I see someone getting up to that wide of a frequency, I definitely want to both start 4-betting him more often after he 3-bets, and also I want to start calling him with a little bit wider range than maybe what I might call, than definitely what I would call against someone who's, opening or 3-betting 10% or 12%, or probably something that might be a little bit more standard for some of the tighter regs out there. And so for me, this ace-9 is actually going to be a hand that's going to get put into a mix between calling some of the time and 4-betting, but I'm actually not going to be folding ace-9. And I'll start folding or 4-betting the weaker aces below ace-9, but we're already going to be adding this one into the defense and never folding it, in my opinion. This time I ended up calling, and before we get into the flop and the rest of the hand, real quick, I just kind of wanted to show you how well ace-9 is performing against some various wide 3-betting ranges and ways that people can construct those range, and see why it should definitely be added into either. It shouldn't be a hand that should be folded once people start getting above 16% 3-bet. And to do that, we're going to use Card Runners EV. And today I'm actually going to analyze 3 different potential 3-betting ranges, because although I have a lot of hands on this guy, I'm not exactly sure, which strategy he's going to be using. And so I kind of wanted to look on average how my hand specifically, or maybe how my strategy in general, is going to be against this type of player who's 3-betting really wide. So the first one here we have is the 3-betting range that's built into PioSolver, and probably one that a lot of regs are using because pretty much every reg these days is studying with PioSolver. And so if they already have that, range that's known to be pretty well balanced and known to be kind of a tough range, it's probably one that's just really easy to start implementing into their games. And so this is definitely one of the ranges that we're going to be using to do our analysis today. What I did was, we got the ace-9 here, and you can see that whenever 3-bets we're calling, and then we're getting to the flop, and you see that 75% equity. And so what that means is we're going to realize 75% of our post-flop equity. So instead of getting to realize all of our equity once we get to the flop, some of the times we're going to have to fold to a c-bet on the flop. Some of the times we're going to call the flop bet and have to fold on the turn and not get to see the river. But usually we're going to always realize at least 60% because we always get to see the first 3 cards. And actually these days the equity realization is going to be a bit higher than that because of how small regs c-bets are. So when he's c-betting 1/3 as the standard, we're going to be getting to the turn at a very, very high frequency. And actually when you're getting to the turn, you're getting to see 4 out of 5 cards, which is actually 80%. But sometimes we are going to have to fold on the flop, and I reduced it a little bit as well because there are a little bit of reverse implied odds issues, and yeah, so I made it less than 80%, but I still think 75% is a nice fair number, and it's going to at least give us a feel for how well the ace-9 is going to be doing as a call against that range. And so against the PioSolver range, we end up calling here, and you can see that ace-9 is at 0.54, so it's not a slam dunk call, but we need to be seeking to make calls that are down to about 0 EV. So actually, even looking at this, you know, if we wanted to add in ace-8, again, that's going to be plus EV. And it's looking like we could actually go down to like ace-4 off. The problem with that is, you know, the lower down in the range we get to, the more we have to deal with those reverse implied odds issues, and the tougher our equity realization is going to be. So maybe while ace-9 might have 75%, you know, something like ace-6 might be 70 or 69%. So this isn't a perfectly exact representation. And, you know, if I was going to widen my range, rather than mess around with a lot of these weak ace-6 offsuits, I would probably start going in more into these suited, you know, 2-gappers, 9-7 suited, jack-8 suited for sure, and things like that that I think are going to have a little bit higher equity realization and a little bit less in the way of reverse implied odds. But I do think that, you know, adding in ace-9, at least widening some of your ace-x calling range is going to be, I think it's going to be a good adjustment. So we have the ace-9 here, and the next one was Poker Snowy. It's one that I talked about in my last video, is that Poker Snowy, if you go to their website, they do provide a lot of different pre-flop ranges. And so I did my best to replicate what their pre-flop 3-betting range looks like that they recommend, and one that I think, you know, again, a lot of regs studying with PioSolver. There's a lot of regs that are also studying with Poker Snowy. So, and especially online, when, you know, they could easily just have a second monitor that has a screenshot of the frequencies and then have a random number generator. Although this is a super complicated strategy, online it would be one that could be replicated. So there's going to be regs out there that are using this strategy as well. Against that range, which seems to be a little bit more polarized, our ace-9 is doing pretty much the same, 0.51 here, with the 75% equity realization. So again, definitely a hand that could fall into the calling range for sure. And the last one, which would be the toughest range that I put in here, was a much more linear range, really relying on, you know, suitedness and connectedness or high card value. This is a range that, you know, let's say someone's a reg, but they're not necessarily studying with Pio, they're not necessarily studying with Poker Snowy, but they do know that they want to, you know, hit a really high 3-bet frequency and 3-bet really aggressive. These are the hands that are just kind of going to end up being the easiest to naturally 3-bet because of the suitedness and connectedness and the high card value. And so this might be a range that people could just kind of fall into naturally without even really, you know, spending too much time thinking about it. You know, mixing a lot of these stronger hands between calling and 3-betting, and then as the hands get a little bit weaker, probably 3-betting a little bit less and calling a little bit more. This is kind of just meant to be an aggressive range, but still very tough and very value heavy, and the one that the ace-9 should be doing the toughest against. And you can see here against that range, we're now down to basically a break-even call. You know, negative 0.06 is basically 0. So it's still one where, even if we're against a range that's that tough, as long as I think I'm going to be doing okay post-flop against the player, you know, if I know that they're just definitely crushing me, then maybe this wouldn't end up falling in the calling range. But if I feel like I'm doing okay, and, you know, because of their position, maybe they have a little bit of advantage, so I'm not going to get to realize all of my equity, but I'm going to be doing okay, then I think we can still put this in the calling range, even against a really tough 3-betting range. So I just wanted to show that, you know, as players' 3-bets get above that 16% threshold, and his 3-bet, like I said, was 17, but all these 3-bet ranges here were in the 16s, we need to definitely start widening that range a little bit. The other thing is, obviously, you know, against a lot of regs, if they're 3-betting 10% or something like that, we're definitely not going to be using the ace-9 as a call, and it's going to be probably a 4-bet some of the time, and then a fold the rest of the time. Okay, back to the hand here. We see the 6-2-9 rainbow flop, the best possible flop I could imagine for this hand, other than like 9-9-9 or, you know, ace-9x or something like that. I mean, this is a very good flop for our specific hand, and our range in general is going to be doing okay on this versus his range, I would think. So I check. I'm always going to be checking to him here, and as we would expect, you know, he comes out with a pretty small c-bet, about 35% of the pot, and I think this is a flop where we definitely get to do a little bit of check raising against any of those ranges that I showed. We do have all of the sets here. We have a couple combos of overpairs, as you'll see with kind of the way that I'm constructing my calling ranges a little bit. And we do have, you know, ace-9. We have a lot of really a decent 9x with the suited connectors. With the suited ace-9, king-9, queen-9, jack-9 are all in our range, 9-10. And, you know, top pair, when his range is very 2 overcard heavy, as far as when you look at the combos, is pretty valuable here. So I think that we are going to want to be check raising the ace-9 here on this board quite a bit, if he's taking the smaller c-betting strategy, which means that he's probably c-betting, you know, 70 to 100% of his range, very high percent of his range. I opted to go for a pretty small check raise sizing. My thinking here was that any hand that I'm check raising for value, even with this sizing, if he does call, you know, the SPRs are going to be about a 1 stack to pot ratio, and we're going to be able to, with relatively small bets, turn and river, play for stacks pretty easily against a lot of hands in his range. And also, if he's, you know, c-betting that 70% plus of his range, if we are bluffing, I think a small bet actually takes advantage of that range pretty quickly, and it's going to be kind of, you know, the wider his range gets, the more difficult it is going to be for him to defend appropriately, even against a really small bet. And so, you know, it works kind of nice exploitatively for my bluffs if he's c-betting too much and not defending enough, and then for my value hands, it gets me that value that I need. It still sets us up for stacks, basically. And ace-9 specifically, I thought, benefited from this sizing because this actually allows us to get calls by things like ace-king and ace-queen. No matter what sizing we're using, we're always getting called by the weaker 9x. And it allows us to get, you know, calls from things like 4-5 and 6-7 and 6-8 and, you know, all those gut shots and things like that in his range as well. So it makes it very easy for us to get value. And with our range as a whole, I thought we were going to be doing pretty well with this sizing. So we'll look into this sizing and compare it to some other options, or one other option when we do the PioSims. But that was my thoughts in the hand at the time when I check raised here. The turn, I think, is pretty much about as blank as it gets for both of us. I guess he can have pocket fours in his range, given that he c-bets so small, and he's probably not folding a pair to that small of a check raise. So if he did 3-bet pocket fours pre, then he can have them. But I think actually the pocket fours, pocket twos, pocket sixes are a pretty low frequency 3-bet in all of the ranges that we put together. And in general, with players that we're playing against, is probably going to be very low frequency 3-bets. So really, we're not worried about sets here. And when we have the 9 blocker, you know, it's pretty hard for him to have a set of 9. So realistically, I would just consider this 4 to be a complete blank. The only thing that improved on this are some of the gut shots that I might be check raising or he might be bet calling with that now turn to pair. So here my thinking was, again, we still have a ton of hands in his range that our ace-9 is ahead of. All the weaker 9x, all the 6x, you know, all the hands that I mentioned on the flop, we're still either trying to get value from or protect against. And again, with a small sizing, we're still setting up for stacks. As you can see, we have less than a pot size bet already, even before he calls. He did end up calling here, and you can see, you know, pretty easy just to jam all in on a river with a lot of our ranges that are wanting to jam for value and some bluffs. So we're setting that up. Basically, my sizing on the flop and the turn was kind of built around the fact that that's what I think my sets would want to do when they are check raising and barreling, is kind of use this sizing. And my thought was that I would just want to build my whole range kind of around what that wants to do. The other nice thing again is because our check raise is so small, if we are continuing to bluff here, I kind of exploitatively thought that this bet would, once again, a nice small bet would be kind of tricky for a lot of our bluffs and still get us some folds with some better hands and also give us just an amazing price on the bluff. Especially if we're, well, all of our bluffs are going to have, you know, a gut shot here, most likely, or at the very worst, 2 overs. So we do have some equity versus his range with those bluffs. So because of that, you know, we pretty much almost need 0 folds because of how small our bet is and the fact that we can sometimes improve to have the best hand. So that's why I ended up going for a really small bet here. The other thing that I didn't mention on the flop is I kind of expect a lot of players to have re-raised with 10s, jacks, queens, almost 100% of the time on the flop. I don't think those hands are slow playing very often. They're going to really want to protect against specifically kind of hands like this that are in my range. They're going to have decent equity against them, or, you know, the gut shots and things like that that I'm could potentially be check raising here. I think queens might slow play some of the time. I think kings can slow play some of the time, and I definitely think aces are a decent part of his slow playing range as far as the overpairs. But, you know, we have an ace, so we're blocking some of those combos, which is pretty nice. Which I think makes this combo specifically a much better barrel than, you know, even king 9 versus the population. We dominate more 9x, and we block more of those slow plays. So if that's the case, that he's going to have re-raised and tried to play for stacks with those overpairs a decent percent of the time, we're not too worried about valuing ourselves really all that often here on the turn with a hand like ace 9, in my opinion, as well, which is another reason why I think we can bet. He will have those. I'm not saying he never has those, but just kind of my take on the tendencies I'm seeing from a lot of the players that I'm playing against and kind of what I expect their ranges to be. So we get to this river, and when the king comes off, I was actually pretty torn here between just jamming for value and going for a check call. I don't think I'm ever going to be folding at this point. You know, let's say I check and he jams, which he did. I only need to win 28, we'll say 29% of the time. And realistically, I think that there's going to be enough gut shots that missed, or, you know, one pair of hands that he flopped or turned that decided to turn themselves into a bluff, or even things like ace queen, ace jack, rarely, not a ton of the time, but, you know, some combos of ace jack that decided to float twice because of how small my bets were, that are going to end up being able to turn themselves into a bluff here. And because of that, I do think, you know, if we do check, we're never going to fold. But we do really have to think about, you know, what's better. Can we jam and get called by enough worse hands for value? I think he has all of the, you know, 6x that bet the flop and 9x that bet the flop, and even a decent amount of the 2x that bet the flop to get to the river because of my sizings. And those hands are all going to call some of the time, blocking my most likely value hands. And if he has a hand like ace 6 or queen 6 suited or something like that, that don't really block many of my bluffs as well, I think those hands are going to call at a pretty high frequency if I jam. And so he does actually have a decent amount of hands that call versus my jam, which makes this a pretty tough decision. So my thinking at the time of why I opted to go for the check instead of the shove myself is I kind of expected the king to be an overbluffed card versus the population in general, and maybe a little bit versus the specific player. Reason being is that no one really expects me to ever have ace king. In my value range here, I think he's going to expect some things like, you know, ace 9 and 9-10 and things like that to have, you know, bet check raise small and then bet the turn. And when I check, I think that he's going to try to overrep the king probably more often than he should. And if that's the case, meaning that he's, you know, bluffing a bunch of things that he shouldn't be, trying to rep the king and trying to get me to fold my 9x or pocket 10s or something like that, then I think that's going to tip it towards us wanting to go for a check call versus just jamming ourselves. But that's, you know, that's pretty assumptive, and I'm not I'm not 100% certain of if that's actually true, if this king is going to be something that's going to be overbluffed. But at the time, that was kind of my feeling, and that's why I ended up leaning towards the check. So I checked, and he did jam, and I called, and he showed up here with the 5-4. Normally, I guess the results don't matter too much, but I actually think that him showing up with 5-4 actually kind of proves my case a little bit. I don't think this is a hand that ends up in the bluffing frequency all that often, and we'll double check it when we get into some of the PioSims. But the reason being for this is, like I said, I don't really ever have pocket fours. I'm not check raising pocket fours hardly ever on the flop, and so having the 5-4 doesn't block any of my sets that I was value betting, and could potentially be going for a check call here on the river. And it also actually blocks a potential combo that I might have check raised on the flop as a bluff, having a backdoor flush draw and, a gut shot. So it blocks, it's only one of my potential check folds, but, that is something to be said. I think when he's bluffing here, he more so wants to bluff with things that have a 6 or things that have a 2. I think 9x might actually be a little bit too strong to bluff. So anyways, this hand did work out for me. Whether a hand works out or not, it's always good to still check if you made the right decisions, and that's what we're doing here today. And let's get down and dirty. So because this video is going to be so long, I'm not really going to spend as much time breaking down what our range wants to do and what his range wants to do in all these various turns and rivers. We're going to more focus on the ace-9 specifically. I'll leave it up on the screen and kind of hover over all the stuff a little bit for you guys to look for yourselves if you want to spend some time thinking about, what the ranges are looking like and things like that. And I'll mention it briefly, but I'm going to kind of glaze over it really quick because we still have a ton to cover here. So real quick, I'll show you a little bit what my range is going to look like. I've been adding in a small frequency of these hands, both in position and out of position versus 3-bets. Reason being is I'm looking for a lot more spots that when we get to the flop that I can aggressively and pretty easily raise or check raise because of how often people are using the 1/3 c-bet. I'm trying to find more spots where I can, start putting the aggression back to them. One, because, like I said, they're using a small c-bet, but also because a lot of the regs from all positions are 3-betting at very high frequencies that I'm playing against. So, fighting back by letting them put in a little bit more money on the flop and then having some of these really strong hands that can, drop the hammer on them is kind of nice occasionally. And it makes it a tiny bit tougher on some board textures to play against my calling ranges, when I can have these hands in there. Realistically, blind versus blind is probably not super important just because these hands have so much value putting in the 4-bet with how aggressive people are 3-betting and then, potentially 5-bet jamming, but still something I'm going to do occasionally. And you'll see here some of these, I don't think a lot of people are 4-betting ace-queens. I do like to occasionally have the ace-queens in the 4-bet as well, which is why you see the 80% call here. I will quickly shift that range if I see that players are playing a strategy where they're only folding or 5-betting. If that's the case, then we definitely want our 4-betting range to become much more polarized, and these are all going to be calls here, and our 4-bet range is going to shift down a step like this, or maybe even, some of these hands here if we just want to use suitedness to help regulate our frequencies. But against a known player or a player, maybe they're mostly 5-betting or folding, but occasionally finding the call a couple % of the time. We do want to have hands that, have decent equity when we get to the flop against their calling range. And so because of that, I'm, wanting to include the ace-queen, specifically ace-queen suited. And I'll actually probably have some of the king-queen suited and ace-jack suited as well. The higher their, the higher their calling frequency against versus my 4-bets, the more these hands are going to be included. we're going to become a little bit less polarized with our 4-betting range. So anyways, this is kind of, it's not an exact range against a specific player, but I think one that represents my range okay. And I would also say that if you were to watch players much better than myself with their defense frequencies, I think you're going to start to see some of these hands get added in as well, and these hands probably played at a higher frequency. But I do got to be a little bit careful, because I do have to recognize, one, I'm definitely playing far from perfect still. You know, if I'm constantly playing marginal hands and, you know, making my range weaker and weaker out of position, that's definitely going to make it a lot harder for me to, you know, make money in that spot. So for me, just to kind of save myself consistently being put in really tough decisions and potentially even weakening my range to the point where I can just get run over, I still keep it, I think, fairly tight. Okay, and the first range, like I said, we're going to be using the PioSolver range. And also you can see here a lot of different bet sizing options. I gave us this check raise size that I used, and then also a 4x sizing, so quite a bit bigger. And yeah, we'll just go in all this and see what we got. So in the first case, we're always checking. And right away we can see here that this is actually a spot where if a player is playing this 3-betting strategy, I think a lot of the regs are going to be over c-betting on this board texture, where we see that they're actually supposed to be checking back, you know, 35% of the time. I think when you see players use that 1/3 sizing, they might actually end up being c-betting closer to 100% rather than the 65%. So we do have a node locked. I didn't node lock them all to not make this video be like 17 hours long, but I did node lock this one with a little bit higher c-bet frequency, and we'll kind of check out some differences towards the end of the video. But for now, we just want to kind of have that in the back of our mind, that that might be a potential difference, and we'll check that out. And so when he does bet, the first thing that interested me was that we actually want to be using our bigger sizing. Well, one, we're only check raising 11%, but the majority of those check raises come from going to a bigger sizing, which is a little bit confusing to me, and I'm not exactly certain why we want to use the bigger sizing. It makes sense from the aspect that, you know, we do have sets that are wanting to get value, but you can see here that the sets are mostly calling, and then if they are, like the 9s here, if they are check raising or using the really small sizing, splitting between the 2s, and splitting, I guess, with the 6s. So we're putting in a bigger check raise with a medium strength range, I guess comparable to his range, and then bluffs to balance our, you know, the value, which our main value is coming from the ace-9, and then a lot more actually calling with the ace-9 off. Favoring the club, ace of clubs X, which is what we had here. If you remember the hand, we had the ace of clubs, 9 of diamonds, which actually wasn't a consideration of mine, that the specific combo that we had should be check raised more than all the other ones, but it's kind of funny that it worked out that way. But yeah, really favoring just getting a ton of value from our ace-9s, and then a ton of protection from our weaker 9, but it also has some backdoor straight potential, and then, you know, the medium 9s are not so much. So I guess my only consideration for why he wants to go to this size, to the 4x sizing, is that when you look at his c-bet range, you know, he's got a ton of king-queen combos, ace-queen combos, ace-king combos, you know, all these ace-x and king-x, and then a bunch of gut shots and things like that are c-betting here at a really high frequency, and the small sizing might not punish them enough. Let's see here, when we make the big sizing, I mean, he still ends up calling here quite a bit with those, well, these have a pair. push the small sizing, 29, 42. So maybe the smaller sizing isn't punishing him quite enough and not getting us enough protection slash value with our 9x portion of our range. But yeah, this was actually a little bit surprising to me that we're using the bigger sizing quite a bit more preferred here, even though we have we're in a 3-bet pot, and so our SPR is going to be pretty low, which usually tends to mean that we only need smaller sizings. Let's look at a couple turns here. So what we're going to do is we're going to get to the turn. We'll run through it with the line that we took, and then real quick we'll go back and run through it with a line that Pio recommends. Real quick though, I did want to point out that when you look at the ace-9 specifically, the EV of each of the decisions, it's pretty darn close. So realistically, we could just simplify our strategy and either use one sizing or pick just a slightly like in the middle sizing and just combine everything together and use the same range, and we would probably be doing pretty darn good if we want to make everything easier for us. Oh, and like I said, I'll go over the ranges here just to really quickly let you guys take a look at it. All right, and as usual, favoring things that have some sort of backdoor equity. That's always the standard. Okay, so we make it 19. He calls. We get to this 4, and boom, we're betting like crazy. And this is another thing that was pretty interesting to me. We didn't, although it's a very neutral turn for us, we still have the equity disadvantage, and despite that, we're still continuing with a very aggressive betting strategy. And again, Pio was preferring the larger sizing here. The only thing that I could come up here in this specific case was that because we had check raised so small, we saw here he's only folding 30% of the time, calling with almost 60% of his range. So he's still getting to the turn with a very wide range, and because of that, we want to and get to just keep applying a ton of pressure to that range. But again, here's something was really interesting to me is we're not concerned at all about protecting our large sizing with our sets at all. And again, we pretty much never have pocket fours here, so I'm just having it in this one so that it's easier to see. But keep in mind that our range actually looks closer to this, where it's really 9x heavy with a splattering of some of the other stuff. And I actually can't come up with a good answer. I mean, the answer that I gave, like I said, he's getting to the turn here with still quite a wide range, and so I guess we're allowed to keep just really funneling in money with these 9x. And we got the pocket 10s as well. I was at least, I guess I'm pretty happy in the fact that I bet small because I was trying to design my range basically based around what my sets want to do and just building the rest of my range kind of to match that. And so at least I was correct in what our sets want to do. And the other thing again here is you can see that the equities aren't terribly different between all the 3 decisions. But as far as a frequency thing, it looks like we're making a slight mistake by not using that bigger sizing and just punishing his kind of wide range. So we did bet the 15, we'll say. And you can see he should almost never be folding, which I think this is one thing that I talked about when I was analyzing the hand a little bit. I think that we're going to see some overfolding here, certainly, when he's only supposed to fold 13% of the time versus what Pio's doing. So as far as our bluffs are concerned, they're probably doing really, really good at the small sizing exploitatively. Things like The king queens are probably folding at a much higher frequency here. Things like this has a pair, gut shot, a pair. Yeah, probably these aren't ever folding. But yeah, I think the king queens are probably folding at a higher frequency here, and probably the ace jacks. And that's about it. So we're not getting too much more folds than what we see here, but I do think we'll likely end up getting a little more than what we see, which is a nice exploitative reason to use a smaller bet sizing if that's the case. And he calls, and the river was the king of hearts. And if we did take this line, we're just funneling in money with a very, very big portion of our range. All 1.5 combos of it, because this line is the least used option. But you can see here that we're still happy to jam for value with our ace nines. And in this case, it seems like jamming, although they're very close, jamming is actually, unless we have the diamonds, jamming is actually a decent-ish amount better. One big blind or something like that, which is reasonable than the checking option in a lot of the cases. Basically what that means is, like I said, we do probably need him to be deciding to bluff a little bit more than optimal on the king. So let's check here and just see if it's easy to. So he should definitely, if he has these aces, kings, queens, I probably don't expect actually players to value bet jacks, tens, even this much, although they might decide to value bet some of the time. So that's another benefit of checking, is we don't get owned versus this portion of his range that ended up not raising for protection, which also I think is going to happen a lot on the flop or the turn. But if he does get here with those, we might get a check back here some of the time, which is kind of nice. As far as bluffs, that's value. He's supposed to be betting his ace queens at a pretty high frequency, and if he has his ace jacks here as well, which I kind of expected, so we're just not going to consider those because he shouldn't have those. Bluffing his ace 2 a small percent, always bluffing the ace 3, bluffing the 7-5, it has no showdown value. 6-4, 7-2 pair, always bluffing these hands. So the one thing that we do see here is that the 5-4 should always be a check back. And that's really the only hand that like Pio isn't bluffing. So I guess if he's always betting the 5-4s, then we do have a slight amount of over bluffing. But really, Pio gets to just funnel in a ton of money. And the other thing is, though, even with a small bet, we kind of said we expected king queen to fold a little bit more than Pio on the turn. So it actually doesn't get to bluff even as much as what we see here, because it doesn't have these value hands as often on the river. So that does make it a little bit more likely that there could be some overbluffs happening if he's bluffing, this same frequency, because he has left value hands to match with it. So it definitely is possible that there is some overbluffing, and if that's the case, I think it's going to either make the check better or at least about the same as just jamming ourselves. So realistically, I think we did actually pretty okay with our decision on the river here. The one interesting thing about the ace-9 is, as we saw throughout the hand, although our frequency was definitely off because it preferred the bigger sizings, the decisions were all super, super close. So I don't even know if I would call it a mistake. The one last thing I wanted to show here is, our strategy on a lot of different turns and rivers, because there's one thing I was trying to figure out is why and on what boards Pio wants this big sizing. And realistically, I can't, I gave my best guess at a reasoning, but I don't know the exact answer for why we really want to always use this big sizing and why the smaller sizing isn't something that we get to use more often, especially when our bigger sizing isn't protected with any of our nutted combos. It was pretty curious to me and something that is still kind of a question that I have in my mind, so maybe something worth debating in the comments, in this YouTube video or in the comments in the Discord. But this brought out some other questions about what Pio is doing on a lot of the other turns when we use that smaller sizing. And we'll do the same thing for the bigger sizing. So the first thing I wanted to do on the top one is we're going to compare our equity on all the different turns after we use the small sizing, and then the strategy, and see if we can come up with some sort of pattern. And the hand that we saw was the 4, so definitely there's a lot of better turns out there for us. Our equity drops a tiny bit, and the 4 is just kind of mixing between both sizings and not doing a ton of checking. And the crazy thing is, one thing that we can see here is when our hand really jumps up in equity, which is on these ones here, we end up wanting to really favor the small bet sizing and just bet a ton. So one indicator for favoring that really small sizing is when our hand has a ton of equity versus, or not our hand, our range has a ton of equity versus his range. And probably the reason being is, when our range, our entire range has so much equity against his range, if we're using a big sizing, it just forces him to fold, probably overfold quite a bit, and so maybe we're not getting the value versus the value portion of his range. And obviously with our bluffs, even with a small sizing, we're still going to end up getting a decent amount of folds. Certainly with this small of a sizing, we almost need 0 folds, so if we're getting any better hand to fold, then we're kind of winning with a small sizing, and we probably get away with it quite nicely on these high equity turns when we get to use that small sizing. So that's my best guess at what's happening here, using the small sizing. Still a little bit stumped on why lower equity turns, if we do bet, tend to favor the bigger sizing and not protecting as much. Keep that in mind as well. But anyways, I'll just leave this up here for a second for you guys to look at if you want to kind of compare the equity versus the sizing strategy. And if you need more time, you can always just pause and spend some time looking at it, but we need to move on here. All right, so next we're going to go over the big sizing, call, and these numbers are getting quite a bit closer. Still, the sets that are in our range, always using the smaller sizing, doing quite a bit more mixing with the ace-9s. So that means our equities are quite a bit closer. And the big sizing here is actually all in. If we had check raised to a larger sizing, it's either all in or a quarter pot block bet, roughly quarter pot. Or maybe exact, what is it? 26%. And yeah, I talked about my best guesses for the explanations for all this. Let's real quick just look at I'm not even going to go to the river on this one because it's going to be the same thing. Basically, with our hands that are value betting, the turn on I guess real quick, we might as well show it on this last one. If we do bet small and he calls, when we get to the river, one way or the other, we're getting it all in with our 9x. He bets here, or let's say we check and he bets, we're never folding a 9x in this situation. And mostly just preferring to value bet it. So that's pretty much going to always happen on the river. And a lot of that, I think, by the time we get to the river is just facilitated by the fact that the pot is huge, which means that the range that we should be willing to get it all in with a weaker and weaker range, the bigger the pot is in relation to our stack size. So I think that's just pretty much what we're seeing here as we get to the turn of the river. We've used the bigger sizing. And one thing that we can see here is that if we do use the bigger sizing on the flop, when we get to the turn, because we forced more folds on the flop, we now, on much more turn runouts, where our equity is quite a bit lower. And we have some just terrible turns here. And very few turns that are just really good for us, like we saw with using the smaller sizing, which is something we're going to have to deal with by probably checking a lot more on some of these. It looks roughly the same to me frequencies as using the bigger sizing. And again, we're kind of seeing a similar trend as when we used the bigger sizing, or sorry, the smaller sizing. You know, things are, for the most part, on the turns where we have less than 50% equity, it looks like we're preferring mixing between a decent amount of checking and betting, and when we are betting, it looks like the bigger sizing is favored. Again, a little bit confusing to me, except for some of these. So the diamond makes sense because on the diamond, no backdoor flush draws came in, so that nobody has a flush draw. So the smaller sizing can be used a little bit more effectively. When people now have flush draws, that is another reason for using a little bit bigger sizing, because a lot of our range that's going to be betting is going to be high equity flush draws or, you know, made hands. But still, our overall range kind of tough to put in a lot of money when our overall range is losing. But Pio seems to find a way. So anyways, I don't have much more to say about this other than just kind of looking at all these different strategies on the different turns. Be very careful of, you know, I guess we definitely need to make sure to recognize which turns are going to be the best for us. And when we do see that the only very clear, easy to recognize pattern is when we get above 50% equity on the turn, we can be aware of, you know, those really good turns for us. We want to be utilizing a lot of betting, almost 100% betting with our entire range. And well, here again, the jack is pretty much evenly mixed, but on the tens, you know, we get to be using a lot of small betting. So there's that one. And that was about as much detail as we're going to go into on the Pio 3-bet. We might come back to this actually in a second, just when we compare it to the node locked and the ones where one other thing that I ran. So here is the Poker Snowy 3-betting range that we talked about. Our second best. Yeah, we're doing the second best here. Starting out almost break even against him. We check. Here he's actually getting to bet a much higher frequency of his range. 77% versus the 60-something% for the last one. And even though he's betting more of his range, we're actually check raising a little bit less. The bigger sizing is used a little bit less, about 1% less, or 0.7% less. About the same here. Slightly more folding, and still a ton of calling. And you can see here again, though, favoring the big sizing, which is super interesting. And again, as far as the ace-9 specifically, you know, the decisions are all very, very close, which is why you see a little bit of mixing between all the different options. And the range looks almost identical to the range that we saw with the versus the Pio range. The only difference is there is more check raising with all these ace-9 offsuit combos. And the sets are actually check raising even a little bit. Well, the pocket 9 specifically are check raising a little bit less than they did in the first one. And I think part of this, if you go back to his range, he's actually going to end up with quite a bit less 9x, which means that having and even pocket 9s, probably roughly the same, but having a pocket 9s in our range is even more impactful because he just has even less combos to continue. You know, even when we have pocket 9s, there are still some 9x combos in his range, but because he has less to begin with from the pre-flop getting to the flop, you know, we just block even more of his continuing range by having pocket 9s. So that's why we see it bet or check raised even less here. So real quick against this range, if we do make it small, we get to the turn. Very similar strategy that we saw against the pile range. Just a ton of betting, preferring all of our sets to use the smaller sizing, and then the rest of our nanics mostly using the bigger sizing, and then balancing with a lot of other gut shots and draws and things like that. Here, so definitely versus this 3-betting range, there's a lot more turns that are just really good equity for us. But the King X is definitely doing quite a bit worse. So on the Kings, we want to be slowing down quite a bit. The Queen X was actually really good for us against the pile range. Against this range, pretty bad, relatively. So now we're ended up doing a lot of checking and only using the smaller sizing. So here, there's a lot more smaller sizing going on all the different runouts. But you know, you can see here again, we're over 50% quite a bit, which kind of seems to be the trend to just having an increased, really small size frequency when we're betting. Let's see. Yeah, this one's pretty darn close. Well, basically, I'm still searching for an exact reason as to why specifically the bigger sizing is preferred in certain situations more than the smaller sizing. Like, for example, like we talked about earlier, this makes sense. I mean, on any 10, we just have such a crushing range advantage. You know, we can use that small bet with an incredibly high frequency, and it does pretty good for a lot of the various parts of our range. But still trying to come up with a better answer than what I've given already for, you know, the rest of it. But you can see here, this is kind of how everything is broken down. And let's say we did play this way against this range. We do want to get ourselves to the river real quickly. So against this one, the king seems to be quite a bit worse for us. We've dropped off a decent amount. So you can see now that our ace-9s actually want to check here quite a bit more often than against the pile range. And he's able to find plenty of bluffs all over the place, which means that it looks like we're not going to be... Oh, he does have quite a bit more two pairs with some of these things out here. But he doesn't have a lot of these gut shots and things like that to bluff with. So... And also doesn't need to be bluffing with the ace-queen if he's using this range. Able to value bet with a lot of king X. So this is where all his value bets are coming from. So let's say he jams. Able to now fold the 10-9 where before we couldn't, but still never folding a 9x. Although you can see the equity is dropping off pretty quick here. But if he's constructing his range a little bit different than the pile type range, we can see that finding quite a few, or we pretty quickly want to start checking. However, it's actually a reasonable difference here between checking and just going all in. And certainly not wanting to use the big sizing. Okay, so that's that one. Let's go back here, check out our big sizing option. Calls. So my thought here, one of the reasons I'm looking at this big sizing is, let's say we check raise. Let's say we check raise really large for the 4x. When we get to the turn, we now have a very tiny SPR, which to me in my mind means that we want to be betting small, doing a lot of small betting and not as much jamming. Or we could, I guess. Obviously, it looks like we want to be doing just mostly jamming when we're betting here, even though across the board, we have a couple above 50. But for the most part, his equity is going to improve versus us over most runouts. Still doing quite a bit of shoving with our check raising range here. And then only on the ace, where we have the best turn for us, deciding to use the small sizing. And one of the big reasons that the ace is so good for us is because we saw that we're check raising a lot more of our ace-9 offsuit combos in this scenario, which just means we have a ton of combos of 2 pair on the ace. So that's the reason we're seeing this be so good for us compared to the other ones, or the PioSim. And yeah, I just wanted to show you guys that. And we can move on to the last one here, or before we node lock some stuff. Okay, this one's versus the linear range. Just show you the range real quick again, just in case you guys don't remember from earlier. And here we can see, because he's got such an equity advantage, you know, an extra couple percent compared to the other ones, he gets to bet a lot more of his range, and that makes sense, just having a stronger range. But even still, and actually surprisingly, this is the, well, not necessarily, because even though he has that equity advantage, he's betting so many more combos of his range, betting that higher percent, that, you know, we're starting to check raise a little bit more frequently than we were in the other ones. So it does, although our equity is lower, he's betting more weaker hands, so we do want to punish those right away with a higher check raise frequency, but it's still not getting all that crazy. And as we can see again, ace-9 is just a mandatory check raise for us on this board. And again, I mean, we're seeing a very common trend here with the king-10, queen-10, jack-10. Here we're never check raising our sets until we get down to the pocket twos. Interesting. He's got more 9x than the last one, I guess, and we're check raising more, but we're not check raising our sets. A lot of questions coming from this one that are going to be a little bit difficult to answer. I guess because he has, you know, such an equity driven range, we're probably going to expect barrels from him at a really high frequency. So let's see if we call. One thing it wants us to donk on the 4 a lot, so let's use a different turn. All right, so there's probably going to be a lot of turns similar to this where he's just barreling again at a very, very high frequency for us, and our check call range seems like it needs a lot of protection against that kind of a situation. And so it's really good to have a really high frequency of these sets that, when he's going to use his high equity advantage to just really just keep barreling pretty aggressively against us. Now, that's not the case if you're, against opponents who are going to be checking back the turn at a really high frequency, even with some pretty strong hands, and not bluffing appropriately, then we probably end up wanting to check raise here on the flop. But, against someone who's going to be just barreling a lot of various turns and rivers appropriately, it seems like we're just taking the check call down line here. And just have a total blank. And he's still just, he's just going crazy. And we've got these nice, beautiful sets here that are just punishing him pretty hard, which is cool. Okay, so that makes a little bit of sense as to why we're check raising these sets quite a bit less, or pretty much never. But realistically, if we are check raising again, the smaller sizing is preferred for the sets. As you can see, it's pretty darn close to the EV of check calling as far as the pocket nines go. Even the twos, although it's actually mixing almost like a third for each of them. The EVs are all very close, so we don't really need to check raise very often. Let's start out with the sizing we used against this. And again, common trend we've seen against all the different ranges. If we do check raise the flop, because we're check raising mostly a value-oriented range with the 9x, when we get such a kind of a dry turn card, we just get to keep barreling quite a bit. And mixing between both, but not mixing with the nines, preferring the bigger sizing. The mixing is coming from some of these, occasionally the pocket nines, sixes, twos that are betting again. Again, they check raise in a incredibly small frequency. And then balancing with some draws and things like that. And all the bet sizing options are pretty darn close here. So let's say we continue with this again. Calls, we get the king of hearts. This is something that didn't really pop up before. We basically got a straight 50-50 split, and it's actually choosing to, we almost never get here with this, but use a block sizing. Bet half the remaining stack with the ace nines. Check the sets. So what's the main value hand here that's betting? Well, the 9x for the small setting. What's the main value hand for the big sizing? We pretty much never have aces. I guess kings that occasionally gets here. Some point X% of the time. Our best two pair would be checking. It's kind of deceiving because it's only, total of 1.2 combos, so it's kind of tough to put it together, but it looks like, realistically, you're obviously just almost never getting here with this line with much of anything, but the big sizing is built around the pocket twos and the occasional pocket kings that we have, and then just utilizing anything that doesn't have any showdown value. or very, very little showdown value to bluff to match those. And then the smaller sizing is built around these 9x, 10s, jacks, queens, and then mixing in a couple bluffs to balance that. But again, not getting here very often with this one. So let's say we bet small and he jams. This is the one case where we actually sometimes consider folding a 9x. Which is why I think it's actually using the smaller sizing for the first time with a lot of the weaker hands. Pretty happily folding something like Jack 9. And let's say we check and he jams. We're going to end up calling with the ace 9 for sure. And let's look at his bluffing range again here, because now so here again though, we're not seeing 5-4 in the bluffing range. And the other thing we were going to check is, like, does he want to turn 9x into a bluff? I'm just going to say he's checking these. Pretty much we're not trying to turn 9x into a bluff, the weaker 9x, or the 6x, really hardly ever. It seems like the pairs are just going to have enough showdown value to not worry about it. So the bluffs are coming from realistically the ace queens and ace jacks and ace 10s. Wanting to turn ace 2 into a bluff, though. So when I look at all these, I think that this is one where it's probably actually, against this type of range, probably pretty easy to overbluff. If he's turning all the 5-4s, 6-5s, and 6-7s, 8-6 type hands into a bluff, not even worrying about some of the 9x, but turning these into a bluff, we could see that he'd definitely be overbluffing, and that I think that might even tilt. Instead of, let's get to here, instead of block betting, we probably just end up check calling. Okay. So we've gone through all the rivers in the line that we used. Kind of showed that I think actually an aggressive or maybe slightly over aggressive reg might actually find some overbluffs. So on a couple of the different runouts, which is promising for the line that I actually ended up taking. Could make it a little bit better for us. Let's just, for the last thing, go back here. Check out if we use the actual sizing we're supposed to. He gets to raise us. I think this is a little bit more than we've seen with any of the other ones. But it's mostly calling. We get the 4. And the most mixing I think we've seen between the two sizes here on the turn. And actually against the linear range, the lowest equity we've had on the 4 turn. And we're choosing to continue betting quite a bit here, but more so preferring the smaller sizing. And it's built around, our king 9, the mixing ace 9s and the pocket 2s, and then just a whole blending of a bunch of other stuff. I'll do it here. I forgot to do the different runouts like I did on the other ones with the smaller sizing. We'll do it with this one first, and then we'll go back real quick and do that. So here again, remember we're using the bigger sizing, which we've seen on pretty much across the board when we use the bigger sizing and get to most turns. Overall, just in general, our equity is going to be pretty low. Another common trend that I kind of touched on in the last one is when a flush draw doesn't come in on the turn, we get to use the smaller sizing a little bit more. A trend that has been, I think, popping up quite a bit is when our equity goes pretty high on the highest 2 turns. We see us using the smaller sizing quite a bit more often, especially after using the big sizing on the turn. Don't need a big bet to get the money in and get to, bluff for a really cheap price occasionally. We just get to bet quite a bit. But yeah, against the really linear, value heavy range, this is kind of how it's going to look for us on a lot of different turn runouts. That's after using the big sizing. And you can see here when we use the small sizing against his defending range, we just have so many, everything's pretty good for us basically, except for the ace and the king. Again, keep in mind though that the small sizing is used quite a bit less, And, you know, as you can see here, we have quite a bit less ace nines because the ace was so good for us on the big sizing. And it looks like here, this is the only one where pretty much the smaller sizing dominates across all the different turn textures, with the exception, the 4 is kind of one of the exceptions where it's more of a mix. I guess there's a couple other where it's all pretty close. And so that is with the smaller sizing. Yeah, the smaller sizing is coming mostly from a little mixing of the ace 9, queen 9, 10 9, and then the mixing of the pocket 2s was the value. And even still, and a little mixing of pocket kings and pocket aces. But even still, when we get to the turn, even though it seems like the range is a little bit weaker than what the bigger size was, because we have all these ace 9s in the bigger size, we still do pretty good because his range to continue to get to the turn has to be so wide when we use the small sizing. Otherwise, we're going to be able to exploit him very cheaply. So really quick to summarize kind of what I've seen, and I'm only going to be talking about our specific hand, is that against all the different types of 3-bet frequencies for kind of an aggressive 16% 3-bet frequency, against all the different ones, we kind of saw that the ace 9 specifically is just, in this situation, is just designed to get it in one way or the other. All the options are pretty close on most streets, whether on the flop it's calling, raising big, raising small, on the turn continuing to barrel, small or big. I mean, it's all pretty close, which means that if we have just a few kind of exploitative reads, it can really tip it in one direction or the other. So one exploitative read that I kind of wanted to check out as a lead into the next one is what happens if they c-bet too much. So real quick, I'll bring this back. This is against the Pio 3-bet frequency. Here was the original. He was betting 64%, and I had node locked him to 81%. So what I did was I went suit by suit. In any hand that was betting at a 50% frequency or more, I node locked it at 100. And if it was under 50%, I just left it the same. So I didn't tune him exactly up to 100%, but I did let him bet quite a bit more. And I think this is actually probably closer to what we're going to be seeing. You know, let's say he is 3-betting this specific range pre-flop. I think this is going to be closer to what probably a lot of the regulars c-betting these days. And so let's see maybe one potential exploitative adjustment that could be made. And this is actually really surprising to me. And I think I'll explain a couple things that I think is going on. And one, we see him c-betting, you know, way more than he should be with a wide, weak range. And we immediately want to start punishing that. Obviously, you can see our check raise frequency goes up through the roof, where before we were check raising 7% and 3.5%. We're now, so about 11% before. Now we're c-betting basically double, or a little more than double that, or check raising more than double that. And the way that Pio works is it wants to punish that mistake right away. And kind of one of the problems with node locking is after Pio makes that mistake on the flop by over c-betting, it's going to play perfectly on the turn and the river. So Pio kind of has to punish it right away by just forcing it to fold any equity that it would have, because basically what's going to happen is a lot of those check raises are just going to, you know, try to realize their equity by checking back the turn and, you know, getting to the river and making decisions and things like that. So we're forced to check raise at a really high frequency against someone who's now going to play correctly on turns and river. The other thing that I think is happening, and why we're not using the small sizing, is Pio is going to defend appropriately after we check raise based on the odds that it's getting, and knows that we're going to be check raising this really wide frequency. So what'll happen if we check raise really small, Pio's actually probably going to defend, even though it is c-betting way too wide, it's going to defend really, really wide versus that small check raise. And when we're now check raising a much weaker, wider range here, as you can see, all these things have gone up quite a bit. I mean, the twos, I guess we added in a little bit more. Yeah, we added in more of the bigger sizing. But realistically, the majority of our range that we're adding into this check raise range comes from bluffs. We would prefer just to get folds from those hands with the equity, but if they do call, we're still using the backdoor draws and things like that. So in order to punish it from Pio not being able to defend super easily and perfectly, I think it's using the big sizing and doing it a lot. I kind of wonder, it would be really difficult to do this, but if we could node lock a bunch of the defense frequencies to where if we do make it small, you can see it's still raising about 10%. It's calling 60% of the time. You know, we would have to node lock this and then node lock some river runouts and things like that. But I think against a lot of players, this smaller bet is still going to, you know, punish over c-betting reasonably well, and it's probably going to be tough for people to defend. Well, with this range, it actually has a lot of gut shots and things like that, so it's going to be able to defend actually somewhat. I mean, actual players and not Pio are probably going to be able to defend somewhat reasonably. But when you looked at the, for example, the poker snowing range, you know, it's missing a lot of these gut shots and backdoor straight draws and backdoor straight draws with a backdoor flush draw and stuff like that it has here. So they're going to be having to defend with things like, you know, queen 7 backdoor flush draws and things like that, which is going to be quite a bit more difficult for a lot of players, even versus a really small sizing. So if we're against an opponent that is going to correct their flop mistake by the time they get to the turn, I think we definitely want to play this strategy. If we can identify that maybe they're making, well, I mean, it still benefits us to just add in a bunch of bluffs if they're over c-betting. So I don't think we want to call with a hand like a really weak hand like Jack 8 when we get so much value from check raising it. So I still think we should be check raising at an aggressive frequency, even if we expect them to, you know, make mistakes by barreling too wide on the turn. That's an argument for, you know, calling down more often with, you know, maybe some ace highs or some 6x hands and things like that, which Pio's already doing. So if they're c-betting too much, we definitely want a lot of check raises, but we might look to exploit if we don't think they can defend as much as Pio by maybe utilizing a smaller check raise sizing. Something in between these two or something like that. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And you guys can see the range here. I'm not going to break this one down too much more than the node locked option. I just kind of wanted to show that massive increase in frequency. And I did one other thing that I kind of wanted to show you guys. So here what I did was I kind of talked about wanting to make my range just slightly tougher to defend against by having, you know, a small percent of these hands in it and giving us some more natural, really easy check raises on a lot of different flops and also really easy check call downs on different board textures as well. And again, it's versus the Pio range, so keep that in mind. So the one thing, we see him actually when we don't have those hands, he gets to c-bet a little bit more often. Obviously, our equity should be doing a little bit worse. Yeah, we have 50% in the non, you know, overpair when we don't have any of them, 49.9%, so it's like 0.2% less. Not only in the equity because it's a solo frequency, but these are very, I would say, nutted type hands on this board. So he does have kind of a nut advantage as well that increases pretty significantly, which I think is the main reason we're getting to see this increase. The one thing that I thought was interesting was it doesn't really change our frequencies for the check raise at all. Almost the exact same here and 0.1 more here. So it's pushing a little bit more into the smaller sizing. And that's really about it. So on this type of board texture, you know, having these hands basically against that Pio range doesn't really change anything. So that was just the last thing that I wanted to kind of look at and analyze in all of this. And that is it. actually didn't end up being as long as I thought, but still a lot to talk about. I think I answered some questions. I actually had some questions. Just to recap on the one thing that I was really curious about is, what's really driving a lot of those bigger bet sizes that we saw on the turn when the range that we're betting is somewhat capped. We saw in a lot of the turns that, the range that we're betting is top pair or maybe, two pair, not really ever betting our sets, but still preferring a bigger bet sizing on a lot of different runouts when it is betting. That, I did my best to try to answer that, but I think it still requires a little bit more thought. So I would definitely, try to maybe see if you could figure that on your own. And if we could figure out that trend and have a really good understanding of why that's happening, I think that will actually lead to more better decisions in a lot of other hands as well. So definitely worth thinking about and seeing if we can come up with a really clear, concise answer for why that trend was happening. Overall, as far as the specific hand was played, although, like I said, although my frequencies were off, I think we had maybe some good considerations for the sizings that were used. Even in Pioland, they were all very close decisions, but maybe exploitatively, I think we might have actually been doing pretty good with the way I played the hand. So appreciate any comments, questions, feedback, anything you guys have regarding this specific hand, or like I said, always if you have hands of your own you want to talk about, hop in that Discord, guys. And looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you all for watching, and good luck at the tables, guys. Take it easy.